This is lesson 2.5b. We are going to be finding the distance between 2 points, which is the same lesson as yesterday, but today we're going to be finding the distance of points when there are decimals and fractions in the order pair. So we're adding on another level of having to remember the rules for when we add and subtract decimals. So first we're going to look at example 2, which is a word problem. And remember, word problems are just stories. So we're going to read this word problem story and think about what's happening. The Coulter family starts at their home and stops at a rest stop to eat lunch. How much farther do they need to drive to get to the water park? Use coordinates to find the distance. So in this word problem, the question that we'll be solving is, how much farther do they need to drive to get to the water park? So let's look at this picture. And if I extend these axes, you can see that we're really just looking at quadrants 3 and 4 of this coordinate plane. So the picture here is showing us how the family traveled from their home to the rest stop. But I don't need that information to answer the question. All I'm going to be finding out is how much farther they need to drive to get to the water park. So they drove from their home to the rest stop, but that's not important information. So let's erase that part. The real question here that we're going to be solving is how much farther do they need to drive to get from the rest stop to the water park. So let's start by rewriting the coordinates for both the rest stop and the water park in your notebook. So the rest stop is at -25 and 75/100ths, -40, and the water park is at -85 and 5/10ths, -40. So let's look at what this means here on our coordinate plane. On the coordinate plane, it's just telling us that we will be moving -25.75 to the left, and then down 40, and then -85.5, and then down 40. Okay, so if you look at these two ordered pairs, we want to figure out which ordered pairs are different here. Well, our x values are different. So we are going to be using those x values to help us find the distance between these 2 points. Now, we do that by looking to see where these points are in relation to each other, and then also looking to see where they are in relation to either the x or the y axis. So we notice that the x coordinates are different. So let's figure out what we will have to do with these numbers. Well, one of my tips yesterday was that if they are in the same quadrant, like they are, right? We see that water park and rest stop are both in quadrant 3. So if they are in the same quadrant, do we add those two values or are we going to subtract them? So my hint yesterday was that if they are in the same quadrant, you're going to subtract them. And let's figure out why that is. Well, I can figure out what distance that water park is from the y-axis. Well, the water park is -85 and 5/10ths from that y-axis. So I will find the absolute value of that and use that information to help us. Now I can also find how far the rest stop is from the y-axis. Well, if I do the absolute value of that -25 and 75/100ths, that distance will help us to find the distance between these 2 points. So look at my picture up here. I use the absolute value. Oops. Let's see, what did I do? Okay. I use the absolute value of the distance of the water park, or from that y-axis to the water park, and I use the absolute value of the distance from the y value to the rest stop, and I want to find this missing distance between those 2 points. So if I take the whole distance and then I'm subtracting part of it, I will be left with that middle remaining distance. So let's find the absolute value here. The absolute value of negative 85 and 5/10 is going to be 85 and 5/10 minus the absolute value of negative 25 and 75 hundredths will be 25 and 75 hundredths. So now I'm ready to subtract these two numbers. So when we add and subtract decimals, the important thing for us to remember is to line the decimal points up. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit there so I have some more room. We have to rewrite these decimal points, remembering to line up the place values and line up the decimal points. So I want you to line up those place values and decimal points in your notebook. So you should have it written like this: 85.5 minus 25.75. With subtraction, you cannot change the order. I'm going to fill a 0 in up top. So I look to do my subtraction. 0 minus 5 I can't do. Borrow from that 5, it becomes a 4. Bring over a 1, now we have 10. 10 minus 5 is 5. Next step, 4 minus 7. Can I do that? Nope. So my 5 is going to become a 4. This 4 becomes a 14 because I carried over a 10. 14 minus 7 is 7. Bring down the decimal point. 4 minus 5. Can I do that? Nope. My 8 becomes a 7. My 4 becomes 14. 14 minus 5 is 9. 7 minus 2 is 5. So when I subtract, my answer here would be 59 and 75 hundredths miles is the distance to go. And I knew that it was miles there because if I move my little toolbar, which was hiding our answer, it tells us that each unit represents 1 mile. Now, I know that was a lot of talking and a lot of explaining for one question, but moving forward as you solve these, it helps us to understand what we're doing and why we're doing the math that way, not just memorizing rules. Okay, so now let's look at question 6 here. Question 6 has 2 points. 5.5, negative 7.5, and 5.5, negative 1.5. So let's take a second to rewrite those two ordered pairs in your notebook. So it helps us to rewrite these ordered pairs. That way we can compare them and we can see which points are different. So if we look at these, our y value is going to be different. Our next step is going to be to decide if we're going to have to add or subtract these points to find the distance between them. So let's just do a little sketch here to help us estimate and decide if we'll be adding and subtracting. So to plot this first point, the one on top, we would move 5.5 to the right and then down 7.5. So that would be way down here. Now for our second point, we're going to plot 5.5 to the right, down 1.5. So just by doing this little sketch, we can see that the points are in the same quadrant. When we have the same quadrant, we're going to be subtracting the numbers because we'll be taking that first distance and the second distance, and when we subtract them, we find the distance in between them. So let's start by doing that. Let's take the absolute value of negative 7.5, and we'll subtract that with the absolute value of negative 1.5. So now we rewrite these problems without the absolute values. So we have the 7.5 minus 1.5. Okay, so when we add or subtract fractions, we have to rewrite those fractions vertically. So I would have 7 1/2 minus 1 1/2. In order to add and subtract fractions, we have to make sure that they have a common denominator. Hopefully, fingers crossed, there's not going to be any tricky fractions with this lesson, but we'll see when we get to the exit ticket. But 1/2 minus 1/2, that would be 0 halves, which is the same thing as 0, right? That fraction's really 0 over 2 is really, there's no fraction left there. And then 7 minus 1 would be 6. So our answer here, the distance between those 2 points, is going to be 6. Now we're going to do one more question where we'll be finding the distance of 2 points, and we'll have to add the coordinates. Okay, so last question is going to be number 5. Ooh. Number 5. Let's rewrite those ordered pairs in your notebook. So we have 4 1/2, negative 3 3/10, and 4 1/2, 5 5/10. So let's start by sketching these 2 points to help us figure out if we'll be adding or subtracting. So the first point up top, we go 4 1/2 to the right, down 3 1/2. I'm not 3 1/2, down 3.3. Our second point, right 4 1/2, up 5 1/2. So maybe I would just sketch to remind myself, oh, going down this way, I went down 3.3. Going up, we went 5.5. So I'm just using those numbers from the ordered pair to help us and to remind myself, oh, I have 2 distances there, both away from that x-axis. So if the ordered pairs are in different quadrants, we're finding the distance from one point crossing the x-axis to the other. So we're going to have to add those 2 y values here. So let's find the absolute value of negative 3.3, and we will be adding it to the absolute value of 5.5. You should be writing this in your notebook. So the absolute value of negative 3.3, absolute value is always positive, 3.3, plus the absolute value of 5.5, 5.5. Okay, when we add and subtract decimals, the key is to line up those decimal points. So line it up. And what's your final answer here? What's the distance between these 2 points? Your answer should be 8 8/10.